pay my respects to elders past and present, and also whenever I present, I also like to acknowledge those of you who are working with young children for the fabulous job that you do, and also in particular those who are working with infants and toddlers, because I personally feel that that's probably about the most important job in the world. So thank you so much for having me. I was very honoured to be invited by Maria to come today. I came to Auckland in 2008, and it was at that time I met Jean, and I met Helen as well, and I learnt a huge amount about what you were doing in New Zealand at that time to support infant and toddler learning. And I came to New Zealand because at that time I was very disheartened, I suppose, by what was happening in Australia. I felt that infants and toddlers were very much overlooked, and that you in New Zealand were doing a much better job, and I still actually kind of think you are. We've come a long way in Australia, but we've still got a long way to go, as I'm sure you have a long way to go in your journey working with infants and toddlers too. So if I can contribute a little bit of thinking in that direction, I will be very pleased with what goes down today. So, okay, so where am I going to start? I find it very interesting to think about, well, how are under 2-year-olds portrayed in the literature? How are they portrayed in our early childhood books? How are they portrayed in the research that goes down? And when I was preparing for this talk, I went to some quite common textbooks and research papers, and these were some of the kind of ideas that came through. Infants are active, inquisitive, curious, playful, even in the absence of specific rewards. So there was this idea that infants are primed to learn. They're intrinsically motivated to learn. And so the implications that we take from that as early childhood educators is that, okay, well, let's provide them with resources and opportunities that focus on self-initiated learning and infant-driven learning. Makes a lot of sense. Would you agree? Absolutely. Here's another one. Here's another theme that comes through quite a lot. Through secure attachments, infants become self-regulated and autonomous learners, and that goes right back to Bowlby. So it's that attachment perspective that tends to come through in our literature. And so the implications of that is that we as early childhood educators, we need to respond promptly, sensitively, and build that security and encourage autonomy. Again, is that very familiar? Yeah, very much so. Here's another one. Infants are sensory motor egocentric learners, and they're solitary players, going right back to Parton in 1938. That still comes through in our textbooks, doesn't it? The idea of the solitary infant. I would challenge any of you who are really interested to find Parton's original 1938 paper and find where she says infants are solitary players. I challenge you to do it. It's a bit of a myth. Provide opportunities for individual sensory exploration and physical manipulation and movement. That comes from that Piagetian, that comes from that idea of the egocentric sensory motor learning. I thought, well, these are really, they're very valuable statements. They do sum up a lot of what we know about infant learning. But if you look at that as well, something tends to come through. Self-initiation, infant-driven learning, autonomy, exploration, individual, etc. And so I kind of got the feeling we've got this baby in a bubble. And the baby's doing it all. The baby's just floating around, doing it all because it's innate, it's self-motivated. And my question, and hopefully the baby's question, is then, well, is that all there is? Is that all there is about infant learning? And I would challenge you, and hopefully this whole talk will challenge you to think, well, no, there's something more. So let's think about an alternative point of view. And I looked at the Australian Early Years Learning Framework and your own Te Whariki. I can never say it quite right. Apologies. And here are some statements. Children learn through responsive and reciprocal relationships with people, places, and things. From birth, children are connected to family, community, culture, and place. Their earliest development and learning takes place through this relationship. And I've italicized the word through for a reason. So what does that mean? Here's another quote here. We need to, as early educators, help children to learn about their responsibilities to others, to appreciate their connectedness and interdependence as learners, and to value collaboration and teamwork. There's a different view of learning that's coming through here, isn't there? And from your own document, interaction provides a rich social world for children to make sense of and gives opportunities for them to learn by trying out their ideas with adults and other children. Cooperative aspirations, ventures, and achievements should be valued. Again, a different idea about learning. The child is not there as an individual. Learning is no longer an individual process in both of our documents. There's that idea that learning is not individually constructed, but learning is socially constructed and collaboratively constructed. So the infant is not doing things alone. The infant is doing things and learning through the relationships that they have with other people, through that interaction that we have, which forms the core of those relationships. I like this picture because this is to the heart of what I'm trying to say. And it actually came up in a wonderful conversation that we had this morning. There were some of us who got together and were talking this morning about the idea of, well, if we're thinking about learning, what does that mean if it's socially constructed? We're talking about what is in somebody's head actually somehow influencing what is in that other person's head, and that interaction that happens between us, not just verbally, but in terms of our thinking. And Mary Gorvain, who I like her work a great deal, she's a psychologist, and she talks about this, and she says, human beings are social animals, and the connectedness between individual thinkers is a non-trivial aspect of human life. And then she asks, how does the individual connect with the minds of others? So she challenges us to think about relationships not just in a way of some kind of emotional connection with people. The emotional aspect is obviously very important, but she challenges us to think about relationships as a way of construing a cognitive connection. When we want to think about learning, we have to think about what is going on inside that child's head, what have I got going on inside my head, and how can we connect? How can we form that wonderful connection? How can we get those sparks to fly cognitively between us? So one way that this idea of collaborative learning is being dealt with in Australia, and I'd be interested to know if this idea has really gained traction in New Zealand as well, is this notion of shared sustained thinking. Is that familiar with some of you? Yeah. Shared sustained thinking is getting a lot of discussion in Australia as a way of promoting collaborative learning. And here's the quote from Iram Siraj Blatchford's work, who has been very instrumental in promoting this concept. What is shared sustained thinking? It's an episode in which two or more individuals work together in an intellectual way to solve a problem, clarify a concept, evaluate activities, extend a narrative, etc. So it's all about working together to learn, collaboratively constructing new understandings, solving problems, clarifying concepts, etc. Both parties must contribute to the thinking, and it must develop and extend. So it's a reciprocal process. It's not teachers teaching and children absorbing. It's a reciprocal process. So what does it involve? It has to obviously involve shared experiences. Adults or children and their peers must come together. Otherwise, you haven't got two or more individuals working together or playing together or interacting. So they have to come together around a shared experience, and it also must involve this idea of reciprocal social interaction in which the thinking is communicated between the two people. So there has to be some kind of thinking-related talk that is going on, some kind of cognitive talk. So to take that a little bit further, Luke Toohill, who works with me at Macquarie University, wrote a really interesting little practitioner newsletter about this. And he summarised shared sustained thinking as saying it's present when there's to and fro inquiry, creative problem solving, chances to review, recap, elaborate ideas, suggesting and wondering, summarising and reflecting. And what is interesting, though, is when I did then a search for shared sustained thinking in the literature, and when I did the fabulously academic Google search, like I tend to do, and looked for where it was talked about, I didn't see one baby talked about, and I saw very few toddlers, but certainly it all seemed to revolve around preschool children. And so I started to think, okay, well, this is a challenging concept for anybody who works with infants. This is quite a tricky concept, yet this is being, in Australia, promoted as being a really important basis for professional practice, regardless of what age you're working with. I thought, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of infant-toddler learning if those infants and toddlers are not really present in that discourse? And even, is it even possible? Can we have shared sustained thinking in infancy with children under the age of 2? Is it possible? Suraj Blatchford argues, yes, it is. She's written a paper, or wrote a paper back in 2009, where she said there was a progression. And she said that sustained thinking, shared sustained thinking, begins with emotional communication with caregivers, then progresses to object-centered joint activity. Sociodramatic play, she argues, then comes into it, and then finally informal learning contexts. Now, this is where she places the 0 to 2 age group. Says very strongly, she talks about emotional communication. She draws on people like Stern and talks about that intersubjective kind of connection that caregivers often have with infants. She talks a little bit about object-centered joint activity, but then you can see the rest of it fizzles out. And again, I thought, well, this is what's supposed to be in there. When we've got emotional communication, do we have to and fro inquiry? Do we have suggesting and wondering, summarising and reflecting? Again, I kind of drew a little bit of a blank and thought, I think we need to think more about this. I think we need to consider this more deeply. So this is, if you haven't realised by now, is kind of a story of my thinking. And I'm taking you to kind of where I am now, which isn't the end point yet. I really like this quote because I think this challenges us to think more about relationships and think more about how we learn through relationships. And this is by Katz, almost 20 years ago now. And Katz said, individuals cannot just relate to each other. They have to relate to each other about something. You can't just interact with somebody. There's got to be content to that interaction. In other words, relationships have to have content of mutual concern or interest so that they can then provide pretext or text for the interaction between us. It provides the content, provides the text for that interaction. So this got me thinking, okay, if we've got to have shared sustained thinking with infants and toddlers, what have we got to have? We've got to have shared meaning. Somehow, those infants or those toddlers need to get together with the other person and share some form of meaning. Now, it might be that the predominant meaning might be emotional at that time, but there's got to be some kind of shared meaning. And here's where I started to consider, well, what about this whole idea of content? And my argument in particular with maybe older infants, and once they're getting into toddlerhoods, there has to be, and I would actually argue it with younger infants too, there has to be talk about that meaning. And hopefully that will become more clear. There has to be some kind of text that's going on between those two individuals. Now, why does there have to be talk even with pre-verbal infants? We know there's a whole wealth of research out there that demonstrates that infants who are talked to from birth, actually, it fosters their language development. Okay, so if we want children to be able to engage in reciprocal social interactions, if we want children who are able to engage in that to and fro inquiry, to be able to discuss concepts and ideas and respond to other people's concepts and ideas, those have to be coded in language. So even with pre-verbal infants, there must be talk about that meaning, because through that talk, you are actually facilitating their vocabulary development, you're facilitating their communicative development. They understand that what is happening to them can be encoded in talk, and that supports their language development. We're fostering language development, we're also fostering learning, and that will become more clear. I'm going to return to that bit in a moment. If we do that, we're increasing the child's capacity over time to engage in that kind of shared sustained thinking that people like Siraj Blatchford and other people are talking about. So it's not that shared sustained thinking is going to look the same all the way through from infancy to preschool age children, but if we start with something slightly different and foster the children's language development through that, and also foster their learning through that, we are going to be then giving them those really important tools that they will then be able to take into their early childhood, into preschool, and so on and beyond. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit further. So what could we start with? Oh, sorry, forgot about this slide. I like this slide as well. This is by Michael Halliday. Has anybody heard of Halliday? Yeah. Very influential functional linguist. And again, this sums up one of the important messages that I'm trying to say. And he said, when children learn language, they are not simply engaging in one kind of learning among many. And I know when I did my initial teacher education, when I came out from that, we used to do developmental records. I don't know if you still do developmental records. And I had the boxes on the page: language, cognitive, social, emotional, and so on. Halliday says, no, language should be overlaid, because when you're teaching language, you're giving children the tools to then learn. So he said, instead of one kind of learning among many, they are learning the foundation of learning itself. It's through the language that we actually gain those tools to learn. So here's my suggestion. I started reading a lot, and I have done in the past anyway, about joint attention. And I thought this could be a possible solution to how we can conceptualize shared sustained thinking in infancy. Joint attention, at the most simplest level, occurs when two people are attending to the same thing. So person A, person B, they see the same thing, they attend to it. And we see this quite often when we're working with infants, where a child is sitting down playing with something, and we're sitting next to them, we're attending to the same thing, we're being very sensitive and responsive and so on about that particular aspect. And I've got a video here that hopefully if I click, let's have a look. And I'm going to show you this. And I want you to think about this. Oh, no, hold on. I might have to do the actual mousey thing. Okay.
Yay! That's fun.
Oh, good job.
Peekaboo.
Okay, I think that was it. Okay. That, at its very basic form, is joint attention. Generally speaking, those adults were paying attention to what the child was paying attention to. But, what do you think the but might be? Help me out here. What's the but? There's not a lot going on, is there? Maybe there's quite a lot of warm and fuzzy, and that's important. They're enjoying each other's company, that's important. Was there any language? No. There's very little there that is going to foster that child's language. It might foster other aspects of their development, but it's not going to foster that child's language. Here's a little... This explains what joint attention, when we're thinking about it from a language perspective, has the potential to do.
From about 6 months, infants can start to involve external objects in face-to-face interaction. Progress in their motor development, for example sitting up on their own or crawling, enables them to reach and touch different things in their surroundings. When an infant and their caregiver both coordinate their attention to a specific object or event and are aware that they are both doing so, we say they are in joint attention.
Què són aquestes joguines? Oh, això vols? Si són les claus del cotxe, que són meves. Mira què fa aquesta, mira. Un pito.
Episodes of joint attention are the ideal setting in which babies can come to understand how people use words.
T'agraden els colors? Que maco, eh? És groc, és vermell...
When adults and babies are interested in the same object and the adult talks about its name or its main features, it is particularly easy for babies to pick up on the function of what the adult is saying.
Qui és aquesta nena? Qui és aquesta nena? Sí.
Taking time to engage in face-to-face interaction and joint attentional episodes in which you talk to your baby about what you are both sharing together is important for language development.
Que fa musiqueta?
Talking about things that have stimulated your baby's curiosity is especially helpful.
És aquest el que t'agrada, el del rac? O aquest? Això és un tros del tren. Sí? Que xulo, és una grua. L'has vist? I aquest? És un tren, Paul, això. És un tros de tren.
So, going back to that then, if we're thinking about joint attention from the perspective of language development, and we're wanting collaborative learning to occur, it's more than just joint engagement. It's more than just doing something together. It's about, as I've got up on the slide there, it's about shared reference. In other words, the infant is looking at something, is engaging with something, is playing with something, and the educator, usually, sometimes the peer, follows in on that. But, and I realise that this looks like a typo, but it's very deliberate, meaningful talk about that shared reference. And again, the literature, the research that comes out about this context of joint attentional episodes quite clearly demonstrates that when the adult follows in and talks to the child about what they're doing, what they're playing with, that the children are then able to extract the meaning from that. They realise that if they hear the same word over and over again when they're playing with the same object, they start to crack the code and go, oh, well, that word must mean that object. They start to use it, and they get feedback on the way that they use it. So, as I said, shared reference is important, but the meaningful talk is what is going to then provide that child with that growing dictionary that we know that they have across that second year of life. We know that their vocabulary goes through an explosion, but it will certainly go through an explosion if they're engaging in these joint attentional episodes. So, it's important to keep it real. I'm both an idealist and a realist. And I know what infant-toddler rooms in early childhood centres are often like. And the joint attention research, usually from a developmental perspective point of view, they talk about, and I apologise to any males in the room, but this is how they talk about it, mothers and babies sitting down in a room with a box of toys, and usually they're brought into a university laboratory, which sounds terrible, but it usually means it's a room that's not being used. And I'm a realist. And with a mat on the floor, few video cameras set up, they're told, please sit down and play with your baby for approximately 10 minutes. I'll now leave the room. They come back in 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Here's your voucher. Okay. All well and good, but how many of you here work with under twos? How often do you sit down uninterrupted in a room for 10 minutes with a box of toys to play with one child? Not very often. So I realised very quickly, I thought, well, you know what, this lovely idea of joint attention, that's great, but really is an infant-toddler room like that? Can we apply this to an infant-toddler room? And there are a couple of pieces of research, an early one that was done by Anne Smith in New Zealand that looked at joint attention, but she came at it from a slightly different angle. But one group of researchers about 10 years ago did go into an early childhood classroom, and they tried to apply this quite classic idea of what joint attention meant to an early childhood classroom with infants and toddlers. And they said that, yes, sometimes this does happen, and they called this stable joint attention, and they said it was when an educator sat down with an infant, usually just one, and was able to sustain engagement with that particular infant. But they also said doesn't happen very often, and they talked as well about what they call dynamic joint attention. And dynamic joint attention, they referred to this as the educator tended to wander around the room, dipping in and out, never really sat anywhere for any particular time, or never engaged with the infants for any particular time. So this became the starting point of my own inquiry for a research project that I'm doing at the moment, where I thought, okay, I want to look at this because I'm not quite sure it's this either-or business. I want to have a look at it and go, what does this look like? So here's a little bit about the research. I wanted to look at what are the characteristics of joint attention as it occurs in infant-toddler educator interactions in an early childhood centre. But I wanted to look more at what were the interactive components, but what were the linguistic characteristics that were occurring within joint attention. So you're going to get a little bit of method here. This is the study that I'm involved in at the moment. It's a big study. We've got 60 infant-toddler rooms. It took us nearly 18 months to collect the data. We have 60 focus educators. We also have 60 focus infants, but I'm not telling you about them. You'll have to invite me back another time. I'll tell you about them when I've analysed the data. 3 hours of video and audio footage. What we did was we videoed these focus educators. They were very generous with their time. We did it over 2 1.5-hour sessions, so it wasn't too onerous on them. We put Bluetooth mics on them so that we could stay a little bit back from them, but we could hear them really clearly. So the Bluetooth mic picked up what they were saying rather than the conversation that was happening behind the person holding the video camera, which was a really important thing to do. For this particular analysis, what I've done is I just randomly chose 6 educators because I really wanted to look very closely at them. There was no way I could look closely at all 60. And in this sample, it ended up that there were 2, we have 3 levels of qualifications in Australia. We have what's called Certificate 3, which is a 6-month vocational qualification. We have the diploma, which is it used to be a 2-year, I don't think it is anymore, but it's that slightly higher level of vocational qualification, and then early childhood teachers who have a 3 or a 4-year degree. And so what did I do? I watched the videos, and I watched them, and I watched them, and I watched them, and I started to look, I was looking for this joint, what I would call types of joint attention. So I started with very broad descriptions and slowly refined it as I was watching, and developed those categories. And then once I developed the categories, I tagged the different categories and went back and looked at each category to think about, well, what are the linguistic and what are the interactive features that were happening? And this is what I came up with. I actually came up with 4 categories, or you could actually argue 3 categories of joint attention, because the first one is non-joint attention. And I'm going to go through them and give you some examples now. So non-joint attention, the infants and the educators are not engaged in joint attention, that's obvious. Here's an example, and you can probably recognise this. It's a kind of example that happens every day. Educators busily setting up the Play-Doh table. She's allocating lumps of dough around the table. You've got a baby who's sitting at the table, pokes his finger into the dough. He looks up, but the busy educator doesn't notice because she's got her back and she's doing busy stuff. There you go, and she puts scissors next to the lump, and the original infant kind of wanders off. It's very easy to be judgmental, but come on, these kind of things happen every day. So the infant and the educator may be looking at the same thing or attending to the same thing, but there's no indication that they are aware that they're engaged in joint attention. So this was one particular thing that I had to go, okay, well, essentially you could argue that joint attention, because for a little tiny brief moment in time, they were probably both looking at the Play-Doh, but there was no kind of awareness that they knew that they were both attending. Continuing on. Educator notices one toddler near the table who's trying to pick up the basket. Thanks, Mia, says the educator, taking the basket from Mia. I'll put these in the cupboard, okay? And she turns and walks away. And she calls over her shoulder, come and play with the Play-Doh. You want to play with the Play-Doh? I'll get you a chair so you can sit down. Mia approaches the table and pokes the dough without looking at the educator, who's gathering chairs. A few other infants approach. Let's sit down so we're safe, she says, and puts a chair behind each infant, who then sits down and begins to play with the dough. So what we're getting linguistically there, we're getting discrete comments, but they were often commands. They were often directives. And they're really not extended. They're very short. They were rarely extended, and there was almost no interaction that was happening between the children. So there really wasn't any sustained engagement, and there was very little opportunity there for there to be any kind of linguistic interaction. So, non-joint attention. The next one I found really tricky, and I went through lots of phrases, lots of words, but I ended up calling it fragmented joint attention, which sounds like it's contradicting itself. How can something be fragmented and joint at the same time? Haven't come up with a better word yet. And it was when educators and infants engaged in short interaction, but there was no communally shared experience. And the best way to give you to explain that was by giving an example. So one educator's on the mat with 2 infants, one of which is holding a small book, and the educator is looking over her shoulder at a child who's some distance away. The infant leans forward with the book in hand and vocalizes in an animated fashion. The educator is still calling over to the other child. Make sure you put them in your locker, please. It's got shoes or something. The infant looks at the book and vocalizes briefly, but also looks up to where the educator is looking. So we've got a little bit of joint attention here. The educator's talking about that other child. The child with the book follows in and starts to look at the other child too. So we've got competing agendas here, though. We've got the educator who is having her attention pulled. She's got the child on her lap, but she's also trying to deal with somebody else who has to put some stuff away. We've got different agendas going on. The educator looks back at the infant, who immediately notices her attention and gives her the book. He vocalizes again. The educator begins to chat. Where are her wellies? She's left the wellies on the beach. She's talking now about the book, so we are getting a little bit of joint attention. The infant looks on with interest, and the educator turns to the book and says, see, it's in the puddle. The infant leans forward to the book and gazes at the page. So we're getting short interactions here. They tended to be less than about 15 seconds, but we are starting to get very short, sometimes with a little bit of reciprocal responsiveness going on. We're getting an initiation and a response. The educator's attention then is drawn to the other child. Eric, darling, you dropped your sock on the ground. The infant at the same time utters, in the puddle, still looking at the book, still looking at the book, in the puddle. But when he gets no reply, he just returns to just looking at the book. So what I found when we had this fragmented joint attention was that initiations were often missed. Or if initiations were responded to, they were responded to very briefly because the educator was just being torn between competing demands. And again, that's normal. That happened a lot. I'm not saying this to be critical. It happens a lot. Fluid joint attention was the next one. And here I had educators and infants engaging in short interactions, but within the context of a shared experience. An example here is in the sandpit, with the educator sitting in the sandpit surrounded by 4 infants and toddlers. One toddler approaches and points, and the educator translates, oh, you want the shovel? Oh, look, here's one here, and she points. Infant Ellie, who's crawled into an upright box, follows her point, and the educator, noticing Ellie, asks, Ellie, are you okay? So the educator's attention, even though they're within that same shared experience, the educator's attention is still shifting. We've got children with slightly different agendas, but the educator is following in on those different agendas. Ellie vocalizes and wriggles into the box. The educator says, the box is really little. And she says to Ellie, whilst glancing at the toddler, maintains her point. She emphasizes her point. See? Ellie begins to grizzle, and the educator asks, do you want help? Yeah, says Ellie, to which the educator says, hold on, and Ellie manages to shift her bottom into the box. She's managed to get into that box. The educator, oh, you got it. Educator retrieves the shovel and turns to the first toddler, saying, this one? And the toddler holds up the shovel that he's found. So we're getting now mutually responsive interactions, but again, they're still quite short, because the educator is still being drawn in different directions, but the talk is still all about that kind of shared thing about what's going on in the sandpit. Educator, oh, you got one? Well, I'll use this one, and she begins to dig around Ellie in the box. Ellie, was it hard work? Was it hard work getting in? And Ellie replies, hard. Educator, can I dig around you? And Ellie watches from the box as the educator digs, and the toddler also is looking on. So this is what I noticed with this kind of fluid interactions, was that the infants also shifted their attention to different entities that were happening in the context. So even though some people might look at that and go, it's kind of same as fragmented, it qualitatively was quite different because the infants were all part of this communal activity and they were watching each other. And when the educator talked to another infant within the group about maybe what they were doing, some of those other infants would follow in and would actually then pay attention to what that other infant was doing too. So that other infant became the shared reference. So there was this, as I said, it's qualitative. When we're thinking about joint attention, it's not just about what the teacher's doing, it's what the infant is doing as well. We've got 2 people interacting, or in this case, 3 people interacting. And the final one, stable joint attention. I couldn't think of a better word, so I stuck with Kane and Rudd's. And here's where we've got educator and the infant predominantly focusing on one external entity. Example here, the educator's sitting with one infant on the mat with a train set, and the infant looks up and says, choo-choo. The educator echoes this and picks up 2 carriages. See, you can join them together. The infant looks up. See? She holds the connected carriages up to show the infant how they join together. It's those magnetized ones. Do you know those? The infant points and vocalizes. The educator says magic. And they pull the carriages apart and says, magnets, see, they stick. The infant looks at the carriages and watches, then looks up and establishes eye contact and smile. He tries to put his train on the track and says, choo-choo, choo-choo, again echoes the educator, and puts her train on a slope, and it rolls down, and the infant looks up with his mouth wide open. The educator responds with an animated, ooh, it went down the hill. So what are we getting here? It's different. We're getting verbal interaction that is focusing on that shared reference, that external entity, but the infant here is clearly responding to the focus and is contributing to the interaction. We're getting something else here as well. What we tended to get when it was stable joint attention was that the interactions provided ideas and extended on ideas and information. If you look at this, think of the concepts that are actually coming through here that that educator is talking to that child about. We're getting a rich vocabulary, and a vocabulary basically is just extending that child's concept base. We're getting quite interesting ideas that are coming through here that that educator is sharing. But, as I said, keeping it real, do we ever get that chance to sit on the mat with one child? Another child joins the area. Infant 2 comes in and says, hi. Educator, hi darling, do you want to come and play with the trains? And infant 2, yeah, enthusiastically. Infant 1 is continuing to play, and the educator now draws infant 2 into the conversation. Oh, both children, I should say. Both children are initiating, and not bother children, both children are initiating and responding to the talk about the trains. So this shared attention, as I said, there was maintained even when a third child joined the play. So what we're getting here is there sometimes were interruptions, but this educator was able to refocus the attention back onto what they were doing, back onto what they were playing with, and very skillfully bring the new children along for the ride. And so, as I said here, it can involve more than one infant. And I think it's a very skillful way of being able to do it, but it can. But the focus of the attention remains stable, and that's what made it stable joint attention. Not one adult, one child, but the focus of the attention and the focus of the talk remained stable. And I said for more than 15 seconds, in some instances I saw examples of this that went on for almost 5 minutes, with some children coming, some children leaving, but the educator basically skillfully allowed the children to come in, talked with them about what they were doing, and then as they wandered off, that was the end of it. So as I said, it requires skillful strategies, establishing the shared attention with the group, and maintaining the talk focus that gives participants all opportunities to engage in the conversation that is taking place. So here is kind of my continuum, I suppose, that I'm proposing in terms of joint attention. And I'm very happy a bit later to take questions about it and hear your views. So let's go back to then, why is joint attention important? And it's all about, when we're learning how to talk, it's all about learning how to mean. It's all about how we give meaning to the events that we participate in. And Tomasello talks about joint attentional scenes, and he says they're defined intentionally in that they gain their identity and coherence from the child and adult's understanding of what we are doing. So joint attention isn't educator and infant. Joint attention becomes a collaboration, becomes a collaborative task, if you like, in terms of, well, what are we doing? What are we trying to do here? There's that intentionality. And also then, what do we know and how can we share that knowledge with each other? And Catherine Nelson talks about this as well and says the infant constructs a beginning lexicon, in other words, a vocabulary, in collaboration with at least one other user of the language in shared activities where the two may interpret each other's collaborative intentions. So again, there's that collaboration, and what we're trying to do is get those minds to connect. That's a different way of thinking about that image that I had with the Mary Gorvain quote at the beginning, with the two brains connecting. How can we create an intersubjective space where we're able to work with and support the infant's thinking, and they're able to also give back to us through that responsiveness, through that reciprocity, and through that communication that they can do, even at a non-verbal stage. We can get that feedback and create that intersubjective space. So just to sum up, all of these different types of joint attention do provide opportunities for language development. Even in non-joint attention, there's a possibility that the child will pick up some of that language, but it's going to be it's going to be difficult. Once we've got a shared reference, once we're actually attending to the same thing, we're starting to get possibilities there to promote language development. And with the fragmented joint attention, it gives sometimes these little short snippets where the educator is talking about something that is relevant to the child, even for a tiny period of time. It gives that infant the opportunity to map that word onto the individual experience, to make those connections. Once we've got a shared experience, though, the learning can become richer. We get the opportunity then for the child to not only hear words, but also use words within that mutually understood context. We are doing this together. And so therefore, these words are within that mutually understood context. It's more relevant, it's more meaningful for both the speaker and the listener. But within the stable joint attention, when we get sustained shared focus, what I found linguistically was that we got dialogue. Okay, we got that sustained interaction, even at the pre-language stage, even with children who were not using conventional words, we got dialogue. And what is really important about dialogue is that dialogue is our way of getting feedback in terms of what do I understand, what do I know, and am I kind of on the ball in terms of what I know? And so an example that I had very recently was it was a beautiful example of another different educator. I was watching a different video, and she had some little Play-Doh cutters, and she picked up one, and it looked to me like it was in the shape of a dolphin or something like this, and she picked it up and she said, "Oh, what's this one? Is it a fish?" And this little child who was just at a one-word stage was looking at it. And she said, "I think it's a fish." And then she gave it to the child, who looked at her and went, "Shark." And she took it back, she looked at it and went, "It might be a shark, it might be a shark." And he gave it back, "Shark." And then another educator came over and went, "You know what, I think it looks like a dolphin." And had a bit of a chat with the first educator, and this little toddler was just, you could see, he was all ears. And he sat there and he was playing with this. And then a couple of minutes later, he looked up and went, "Dolphin." Now, whether or not he knew those words before, I don't know. But this was a child who was only about 1 year old. And as soon as he said dolphin, what do you think the educator said? She said, "Yeah, you know what? It might be a dolphin. Let's see if we can make some more dolphins." And so he got a response in terms of, okay, I used a word in a way that I can now be understood in terms of using that word. I have learned how to mean, and I can get my meaning across, and I can get my meaning understood. So talking to learn or learning to talk. Talking to Learn, Lev Vygotsky, who most of you will be familiar with, said thought is not merely expressed through words, it comes into existence through words. Because through words, we learn to name things, and therefore we learn to categorize things. Words are concepts. Words enable us to develop conceptual understanding about stuff that is out there. Words enable us to make our own ideas visible. Unless you actually use words, nobody else knows what you're thinking. You have to be able to express those in words. They might understand what you're feeling if you're using non-linguistic communication, but unless you use words, nobody knows what you're thinking. And so therefore it makes them accessible. Accessible to manipulate, accessible to extend, accessible to challenge, and so on. And therefore, words make ideas negotiable. And we don't learn unless we negotiate our ideas, unless we change our ideas, unless we extend on them, unless we take them further. We just simply don't learn. Our learning becomes static. So going back to shared sustained thinking, both parties must contribute to the thinking and it must develop and extend. And so, as I said, my proposal is through joint attention, we see that pathway of learning for infants and toddlers that will enable them to develop into this more maybe refined, more mature, more sophisticated notion of shared sustained thinking that we get in the literature. Because through these different forms of joint attention, we see increased capacity to support children's learning development. But not only that, through the language that happens, we get increased capacity for collaborative learning. And I will leave you with this lovely cartoon, which I think sums up, hopefully, what I've tried to get across. So, very happy to take questions and comments, but thank you very much, everybody, for listening. I hope I've given you something to think about.
Sheila, I've been asked to make some comments and open up the floor, obviously, for any questions or thoughts. So for me, do I need it? I've got a very loud voice. I do think of some alerts, one being I think we have to be very careful not to teach, but thinking about learning. For example, if we held up a car or a truck and said, truck, truck, you know, this is how you say it. I think we would have to be cautious about that. I think they would probably switch off. This is a very strange person indeed. So that was an alert that I had, really, because I think there are lots of challenges in what Sheila has offered to us. I love that notion of togetherness that comes from joint attention. And I absolutely take the reality, and I immediately think of small groups. If you have small groups, it is so much more that intimate setting. If you don't have small groups, make them. You know, I mean, you have to, don't you? Because if you've got 30 children up to the age of 2, you know, things are not necessarily going to be conducive. The other thing is the joy, always. There's got to be joy in these situations, and I think this is what's going to bring us a lot of joy in the we. The joy in we are doing things, that notion of togetherness. And I love what you're saying about getting feedback from the dialogue, and I also enjoy that idea of a conversation. But I think I'm very proud of the fact that Degotardi has that notion of reciprocity, that it is a reciprocal thing, and it's as much about perhaps listening and for us in learning and being amazed. I like the dolphin example and shark. You know, there are things that emerge that make us aware of how that child learns. I like your phrase of learning how to make to mean, of which I put learning how to make meaning, which I think is what you're saying, and I love that.
It's a holiday thing, I have to give him credit.
Right, I really, really love that. And the fact that words make ideas negotiable, I could very much relate to that. And your summary of, you know, through joint attention we see pathways of learning. And it just reinforces again for me what a privilege it is to work with very young children who are emerging, I suppose, in a way, aren't they? You know, and you're absolutely privileged to be there to see that aspect. However, I would say that perhaps with some of the RIE ideas about uninterrupted play and stepping back, we must be very careful not to step back too far and to step forward sometimes and engage in that joint attention. I think you've given us an extremely interesting framework to work with, to be able to see the different transitions or the different aspects of our work. And again, it lays emphasis to the fact that we are qualified professionals. You know, it's not just mucking about, is it? It's not just mucking about. It's actually focusing and listening, and dare I say that's what we get paid for? I'm not sure, because we don't get paid enough really, do we? But we do. That's our responsibility, and it's a huge responsibility. And I admire what you were saying to us about the language opening those windows onto the world. There are just so many perspectives. I'm thinking, you know, cultural differences, etc. So maybe people have got an opportunity now to ask any questions or make comments.
Please do.
I didn't use that at all. I hope everyone heard me.
Yes.
I touched on a point at the end there around cultural differences. So there certainly must be challenges for early childhood practitioners in that field, that we have multicultural centres. So the language, the first language for that child may be totally different from the language of the educator.
Yes.
So how do you get around that challenge?
I think it's a very good question, and it's something that I don't feel at all qualified to answer. Sorry. But I think that certainly some of the principles that I'm talking about are just as applicable to a child who is learning a second language as well as learning a first language. And the children who are in early childhood centres where I guess English is the predominant language, hopefully those children will grow up to be bilingual, maintain their first language, but also they need to become, within the Australian context anyway, they need to become proficient in English as well. And so those kind of ideas about joint attention and meaningful talk can support them in their English development. Now, I guess also helping the parents to understand the importance of doing that in their first language as well, and doing that at home. Or if you've got educators who are in your centre who speak that language, to actually apply the same principles in their own language, in that language for that child. It's all about the meaningfulness. And so for what Jean was saying, yes, it's not meaningful if you hold something up in front of them and go truck, 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 truck. It's just not meaningful at all. But if you're following in on the interest and so on. So
I think it's about that being in tune too, isn't it?
It is, being attuned.
They might say something without you necessarily having to say
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
But then when they've said it, you've got a little clue.
Little clue, a little opportunity to then engage with them in dialogue. Yeah, absolutely. It gives them a clue. Now, if that engaging in dialogue at that particular time means that that's going to completely disrupt what they're doing, save it for another time. Remember it, save it for another time. But yeah, so the whole issue of bilingualism is not an area, as I said, that I have a specialisation in, but I can see the same principles applying for people who are first or second English language speakers. Yeah, yeah, if that helps. Yes?
Fiona, thank you, Sheila, for drawing our attention to the way in which the joint attention is so important, and that joint construction, that meaning making. And I think that the earlier question about children who are learning more than one language in your environment, and you might not share a language in common, but one way to take on a language would be to be very clear that you can see somebody's face. And I think that you've drawn us back into this, the face-to-face, where I can have a direct gaze opportunity, and the way I'm making my English or my Mandarin or my Amharic can be actually seen
Yes.
and almost felt. Did you know, so the
Yes.
intonation patterns,
Absolutely.
language they are taking on and that the child's receiving that.
Mhm.
But if you're looking away over here and I'm just
Yes.
forget it,
Yep.
you know, and the noise, that would be the other thing that Jean would like to
Mm.
mention, is the noise inside of early childhood.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And we're analysing that as well. Yeah.
So you've got to be able to hear and see.
Yes, I think that is absolutely spot on, and I think this is why this applies to pre-verbal infants as well as infants. If you can't see that child's face, if you can't, and I agree, you feel that communication between them, then how are you going to talk in a meaningful way to that child? Because when the child is non-verbal, all of your talk has to be interpretive. You're making an educated guess as to what that child is trying to say to you or what that child is interested in and so on. So it has to be interpretive. And it's very, very difficult to be interpretive when you can't see somebody's face and you can't see their gestures. So much of what we do, even as verbal, language users, look at me, is non-verbal, and I'm looking at your face. It would be awful if I was talking to you like this. You would find it really hard to follow me, and I would not be able to talk to you in a meaningful way because I'm responding to what I'm seeing. What is interesting is another part of this study, and the paper's just gone back to the journal, so hopefully it'll come out fairly soon, is looking at mealtime talk. And we analysed the talk that was happening at mealtime, and we coded it for kind of sophistication of language support. And lo and behold, the educators who sat with the children had a much higher quality of language support than the ones who were circulating constantly, because they couldn't see their face. They're talking to the children from behind. And so what was most of the talk about? Do you want more banana? Do you want more banana? If I hear, do you want more banana? One more time. So it was all that managerial talk. And what kind of response does "do you want more banana" invite? Yes or no? Does it involve dialogue? No. You're going to get one comment back. Whereas the ones who were sitting were able to then take that conversation further. And we had conversations not only about what they were eating, but once they got beyond that kind of managerial business talk, as in, if you all got something on your plate, are you all happy? Then they started chatting about what did they do this morning? What are they going to do? Who dropped them off this morning? What did they do on the weekend? All of this really rich talk that took the learning beyond the absolute here and now. And that talk is empirically related to literacy development, because let's face it, when you're at school and you're asked to write about something, you have to write in a way that communicates ideas to somebody who is not there right here and now. And so that talk that takes children further is actually preparing them for that literacy-oriented schooling world that they are heading towards. So we talk about school readiness for babies, talk to them about rich things, talk to them about interesting things, and you're actually promoting that.
And I think the authentic opportunities, like in the routines in a lunchtime, but I think it means that we have to organise ourselves so that
Absolutely.
rather
That's
than
it.
doing all that passing around,
Yes.
etc., but enjoying the opportunity
Yes.
to extend the language and thinking about something that's meaningful to them. like
That's
the banana.
exactly, it might be, but the banana might be the most meaningful thing at that particular time.
I'm sure you can find quite a bit to talk about bananas.
Yeah. But yes, and embracing and capturing the learning opportunities that are in those experiences, all of those experiences, is really, really important.
The other thing is sportscasting, and I don't know whether that's a term that people are aware of, but actually reflecting just what's happening in actions, and so then you can see if there's a response or
Yes.
not, and if there's no response, well, it's obviously not relevant.
Yeah.
But sometimes you need that, don't you? to
That's right. Yes.
suss out.
Frame what they're doing in language. Allow them, give them the linguistic frame that they can then take forward. Yeah. Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
Interesting when she said truck.
Yeah.
Because at the moment we have a child who is very, he's so interested in trucks. So we're being discussed and tried. So I need your help. We've been discussed and tried to arrange and sort out, and we have lots of trucks in the room now because of these pictures.
Yes.
Kind of big trucks, and after that we are trying to ask about the colors and everything. But as soon as he come in the room, Lani, my name's Lani, Lani truck, Lani truck. So we are trying to do things which, you know, we know very well he's so interested in trucks. Well, can you help me, or what else can I do so that...
Or even saying something like, oh, where's our truck today? Or something, you know, like...
Oh, yeah, because those are the only words he's talking now.
Okay, then inject more vocabulary around the trucks. Talk about the wheels, talk about the engines, talk about what the truck can carry. Yep. Yep. Use your imagination to bring in other things around the trucks and talk about those. So extend it, extend it, extend it. It's a very common kind of misconception that we have to use simple and restricted vocabulary with infants and toddlers. Again, the research suggests very strongly that the broader your vocabulary is, it actually supports those children's language development. So bring in new things, bring in other things that are related to it. And also, as an early childhood teacher, sometimes it's okay to say, you know what, we've had the trucks an awful lot, let's go and see this today. You know, there's a kind of misconception, I think, in early childhood that we always have to follow the child's interest and can't do anything. As teachers, I think sometimes we can embrace the moment and say, well, you know, let's go in a slightly different angle every now and then.